In the second part of this video series looking at the 7-inch figures from Neca's Aliens line, I'll be taking a look at what I've loosely termed the civilians in the line. Now it's not strictly true because you will see there is Sergeant Apone in there, but as he was released as a separate subline celebrating Kenner's imaginative releases in the 1990s, I thought he fit better here than he did in the previous Colonial Marines video. So starting with Ripley, of course this was the standard release Ripley, which utilised the bubble packaging that we saw in the previous video. Again, it is all mostly window display, with a paper insert acting as the banner at the bottom of the packaging and as the background sheet, and it is a very, very thin paper, so it can be tricky when you're removing the figure from the casing. And the design follows the same branding as we saw on the previous releases. It has that very dark blue. We see lots of grates and various nondescript plating that would resemble any part of the environment that the characters find themselves in the film. Of course, it is that consistent deep blue as well, which contrasts quite nicely against the figure and allows the figure to really pop inside this packaging, which is really fun. On the side panel, we have these very stylized photos that Neca have taken showing the figure in all its glory. And likewise on the back we have another fantastic display. We actually have the Ripley figure facing off against the alien queen, and we can just see in the corner there a destroyed bishop, which is pretty cool. Underneath that there is a synopsis of the film and then the other figures available in this wave. All in all, this is pretty attractive packaging. I really like the design, it's very displayable, and I particularly like that they've done a separate photo shoot for each figure, so each one feels unique and distinct. Now, as the lead character of the film, Ripley was a very highly anticipated release for me. But I have to say there's a couple of things that I find a little bit disappointing about this release. One in particular is the fact that she tends to look quite hunched and as if she's leaning forwards. The head sculpt is quite good in terms of the actual likeness. If we look at a photo of Sigourney Weaver from the film, this is pretty accurate, but there's just something about it that just throws it right off and it just looks a little bit strange, and I think it's the hair. And although the hair again is pretty accurate because it is quite tall, quite big hair there, it just looks a little bit too big, it looks a little bit too tall, and so it feels as if the whole figure is out of proportion somehow. The upper torso and arms look to be a brand new sculpt from what I can tell, and this for the most part is very nicely sculpted and quite nicely painted as well. We can see some of the dirt patches around the shoulders, around the neck there, which looks really, really cool. Again, having that fine detail just adds a lot more character, which is fantastic. Also, I do really like the bullet belts that she has sculpted into the torso there, but she also has this loose rubber bandana as well, which is movable and malleable, which is quite nice because it adds an extra texture to this figure, and I think they've done a pretty nice job of that. I also like that on the hands they've actually gone to the effort to colour in her fingernails as well, which is pretty cool, and I think the sculpting of the legs is really effective. It's definitely created that look of those baggy pants that she wears. It looks really natural and flowing. There's lots of little details in there like the zips, and it's all very nicely painted. We have the core colours, but then we also have this extra wash run over it to create that sense of dirt and authenticity, which looks really good. And likewise, again, the detail on the trainers looks fantastic. The articulation scheme is pretty much identical to what we've seen previously, but I will run through it once again. She does have a ball joint in the head, so she can move her head from side to side. It can also look up and down a really healthy distance as well. So all in all, this is a very effective joint, allowing maximum posability. She also has ball joints in the shoulders, which allows the arms to kick up and out. There is a pin swivel at the elbow, which of course rotates 360 degrees and hinges to roughly 90 degrees. There is also another pin swivel at the wrist, and it's one of those very delicate Neca pin swivels here, so there is a very, very thin piece of plastic holding that together, but the hand will arc forwards and backwards a little bit, and it will rotate 360 degrees. Now there is another ball joint in the waist, and it will allow the figure to move from side to side, and she can lean forwards and backwards a good distance as well. Now there's ball joints in the hips as well, allowing the legs to kick out to the side and kick forwards and backwards. The joint can look a little bit unseemly. It's, for the most part, it is well hidden by the rubber pants, but that in itself creates certain issues in terms of the colorization looking a little bit different between the rubber pants and the plastic part of the pants, but nevertheless, there has to be a trade-off somewhere, and I think this is fair. Now, there is also another pin swivel at the knee, allowing the leg to move from side to side and also hinge to 90 degrees. And then there is finally an ankle pivot in the foot, allowing the foot to arc forwards and backwards a little bit, not a huge amount, but a little bit, and move it from side to side a little bit as well. Now, sadly, she is pretty light on accessories. She just does come with her one weapon, which is pretty cool. Obviously, it's a combination of the flamethrower and the pulse rifle. And they've done a pretty fantastic job with the sculpt and, of course, the paint applications on this, making it look really lived in, chipped, worn, damaged. I think it looks pretty cool. All in all, this isn't a bad figure by any stretch of the imagination. However, I have to say I am left with this lingering sense of disappointment with it, because it just looks ever so slightly off. It does feel like she's quite hunched a lot of the time. It does feel like she has a tendency to want to lean forward. And as I said, that hair there just looks a little bit out of proportion for me personally, and just kind of ruins the look of the figure. Now, I should point out that this isn't the only Ripley we got, because they did release a tweaked variant later on, which also included Newt. Now, I don't have the Ripley figure in hand. I do have to rely on what I can see from photos, but it does look, as you can see here, that they've made tweaks both to the paint apps. We can see a lot more dirt on the pants, for example, but also, quite crucially, the head sculpt. Now, the hair here seems to be a lot shorter and it looks a lot better. It's much more closely fitted to the scalp and it just looks a lot more in proportion. So judging by these photos, I'd have to say that this looks to be the superior release. Now, Newt was also released single carded as part of an exclusive to Comic-Con one year, so having her re-released at mass alongside Ripley makes this a very attractive offering. As for the Newt figure itself, again, I don't have the figure in hand, but it does look to be very nicely done. The head sculpt looks to be pretty accurate, the costuming and the paint apps all look spot on, and she even comes with some pretty fun accessories as well. So I have to say, I think this is a really solid release, and if you can get your hands on it, it's probably the best one. There's another Ripley variant with her bomber jacket. For the most part, this seems to be the same figure with the same head sculpt, with just a slight tweak in the arms and the upper torso. The other key difference is that she comes with a blast effect for the pulse rifle as well. Next up we have Bishop, and again, another highly anticipated release for me since I'm a huge fan of Lance Henriksen. It's fantastic to actually have a figure of him in the 7-inch scale. I was also really impressed by the sculpt, the likeness of the actor in this figure as well. I think it's very, very plain. You can see immediately who it is, and I think they've done a really good job of it. Now, when you look at it against the photo of the actor himself in the film, I do think they've been maybe a bit heavy on the eyeliner, but other than that, I think they've caught his likeness very well, and this looks really, really good. Now, to be fair, Bishop's costume in the film is pretty bland and boring. It is essentially just blue overalls, a big jumpsuit that he wears throughout the entire film. But Neca have definitely done their best to bring in as much detail as they possibly can. We can see lots and lots of little zips and pockets and various bits and pieces on this costume, which is very nicely done. For the most part, it is pretty much one tone. There's a little bit of a wash running through it to give it a bit more depth, which is great. And the main torso of the figure is made out of rubber. It's like a rubber shell going around the figure to hide some of the joints, which can look quite effective. I think it works very well here with Bishop. It's not too obvious where the rubber ends and the plastic begins, which is really good, and there can often be an issue with this kind of approach. But it does often tend to leave the crotch area looking a little bit baggy and a little bit out of proportion. And there's some nice detailing on the arm as well. We can see that patch he has on his arm there. It's very finely painted and has a lot of detail on it, which I think looks really good. Again, we can see plenty of detailing on the legs, and in particular in the trainers, and we have that wonderful paint wash there making them look dirty and used, like they've been running through the mud, which looks absolutely brilliant. Now, because of the rubber torso, it is difficult to see whether there is actually a ball joint in the waist. When I tried to move the figure, I definitely struggled to get it to move from side to side. There is some give there, but I was never sure if it was coming from the legs or from that ball joint. It doesn't seem to want to move forwards or backwards as much either. Bishop is also fairly light on accessories. He does have the canister, which looks very nice, nicely painted, nicely sculpted, looks pretty screen accurate, and I think they've done a really nice job of this as an extra prop to have. He also comes with a knife and an extra hand to grip the knife. For me, I think Bishop is a real win. I think he's got a really nice sculpt. He definitely represents what you see on screen. It does feel like that character has come to life in plastic form, so I'm really happy to have him in the collection, and I really like the character and the actor, so for me, this is a win all round. They did also release a variant of Bishop, which is the Bishop Queen attack, or Bishop as he is after he's been savaged, and we can see obviously he is just half the man he used to be. I have to say, when this figure was released, I must admit I definitely had reservations, hence why I never picked him up, because it did feel a little bit cheeky re-releasing the figure but half the size. But now, in hindsight, I think it's actually kind of a cool release. It's definitely one of those fantastic world-building elements that you just couldn't get any other way. I think there's a lot of detail when it comes to his poor entrails there that look really good, and obviously it is a new head sculpt as well. Plus, you do get that open egg and, of course, the face hugger there, which I think is pretty cool accessories, and like I said, they build up the world very, very nicely if you want to create a diorama. So in hindsight, I actually think this is a pretty cool release, and I wish I had picked it up now. Moving on to the Sergeant Apone, or as it's been labelled here, Space Marine Apone. This is part of a sub-series of figures that was basically looking at the old Kenner figures from the 1990s, which of course took their own artistic license with the line and had some very colourful interpretations of some of the characters. I'm personally a really big fan of this approach. I really love the nostalgic element of being able to recreate those old toys, but upscaled to 7 inches and given the Neca treatment in terms of detailing and paint apps and accessories. But Apone is particularly special because, of course, we never got him in the official Aliens movie Colonial Marine outfit that we see, which I believe is due to some licensing issues and something to do with the rights, which is a real shame for collectors. So this Apone is a very nice stand-in. Now the packaging is a little bit different from the standard Aliens line because, of course, it is replicating the Kenner packaging. Neca have even changed the font of their logo to match the Kenner branding of the time, and this is quite colourful and fun. In the background we can see an image of the alien head there, which looks pretty cool, and it's a bit more colourful, a bit more bright, and we can see that very cartoon-like image on the front of the packaging as well, which is a nice touch. Likewise, the reverse of the packaging is also modelled on the Kenner design, and I have to say I'm a huge fan of this. This works all these years later just as it did way back in the 90s. I think this is really colourful, really fun, and obviously it just makes me want to buy all of these toys, which look fantastic. Moving on to the figure himself, well, I have to say, first impressions were that he was really, really impressive. The brighter colours on this figure really help him stand out. In terms of the sculpt, we can see here that they've done a pretty faithful job of replicating this figure from his 90s appearance, which I think is very fun. But as someone who really wants an Apone from the film, I think they've actually done a pretty decent job of the likeness here too, so I do think that this is a fairly decent compromise. I really love the costume and the sculpting of the costume here. I think it works really, really well. It's one of those flights of fancies that Kenner took to make the figures look really distinct and bright and colourful and fun, but I actually think it works an absolute treat, and all these years later definitely helps make this character stand out from the other Colonial Marines in the set. Obviously the colours do that job, but also having that metallic arm there as well makes him look very distinct and individual and fun. And we see this running through the entire figure. We can even see it in the legs and the shin pads that it has there. Again, really nice touch, very, very well sculpted, faithfully reproduced, and then just wonderful paint apps to just dirty it up and make it look worn and lived in, and like it belongs in the Alien universe, which is really cool. And as you can see, there's just tons and tons and tons of detailing in this arm, which I think is absolutely fantastic. The central piece is actually a loose sort of rubber piece, which actually has its own articulation, so it looks as if the pistons are moving and turning, which is fantastic. And the paint wash does an absolutely fantastic job of enhancing that sculpt, helping to add a lot of detail and texture, and just really make the most of all the great parts of this sculpt. And as I said, the outer shell is actually quite a loose, malleable rubber as well, so it's fairly flexible, it will work with you, and there's no hindrance to the articulation whatsoever, which is really solid stuff. His articulation scheme does differ slightly in just one area to what we've seen already, and that is that his ball joint is in the upper torso rather than in the waist, so he can move from side to side fairly comfortably. He can't really bend forwards and backwards very much though. But best of all, he's absolutely loaded with ordnance. He comes with a shotgun, 2 grenade sticks, I think, and then 2 wires, which I must confess, I have no idea what these are for or where they connect to or what they're supposed to do, so apologies. As ever, please let me know in the comments if you know what they're for. But he also comes with these fantastic stickers, which are a really nice nod to the original Kenner release, because they also came with these stickers, which is pretty fun. And then finally, they've gone to the trouble of creating a mini comic book as well. Now, I love the front cover to this. It looks very much in the spirit of Dark Horse back in the day. I don't know whether this is a newly commissioned comic book and newly commissioned artwork to have been created for this release, or whether they're reproducing one that was released for the original lineup of figures for Kenner back in the day. But either way, it's really fun to have it in this scale, and it's a really nice little extra touch. Now, the grenade sticks, for lack of a better term, apologies, I don't know what they're called, what they really are in truth, but they connect into his backpack really nicely. So they also disconnect as well, so you can take the what I think of as the grenade head away from the main stick, which is pretty fun. So he can also hold these in his hand, and yeah, looks pretty good all in all. I have to say this is kind of fun. The one issue I did have though is with the shotgun, because I did not very easily go into his hand. I had to really force it in there, so that's maybe not fantastic, but otherwise it looks really good, and I think they've done a really nice, very fun job of this figure. Now, as part of this Kenner tribute, they also re-released Vasquez and Ripley. The Ripley looks to be exactly the same as the original standard release, but with a Neca chief, a different paint job, and I believe she also came with the smart gun as well. Likewise, for the most part, the Vasquez looks to have been recycled and just repainted in brighter colours from previous releases, although I do think that this torso is new. And then finally we had this special Hadley's Hope 2-pack, which is the exclusive release of Carter Burke, who comes packaged with a pretty much standard alien that we've seen many times before. And also, as a neat prop, they had the Hadley's Hope sign as well, which is pretty cool. Again, great for diorama building. In terms of the Burke figure himself, this looks to be pretty faithful. Again, very difficult to judge based on promotional photos and without seeing him in hand, but I think they've done a pretty nice job. They have decided to give him that sort of shocked, scared expression on his head, which I'm not always a huge fan of, but I think it works pretty well for this figure, and he is distinctively different to any other figures in this line. He's a lot more colourful, and obviously has a very different kind of costume, which is kind of fun and makes him a bit more interesting in the collection. And I think that just about catches everyone. So by this point we actually have a pretty big collection of core characters from this film. We have the main heroes, we have Ripley, we have Bishop, we have Hicks and Hudson, we even have Newt, and of course we have Burke as well. So we have a lot of the subsidiary characters as well, and of course some extra Colonial Marines thrown in for good measure. So I think in terms of the human characters, we've actually been very well served by Neca, and I think they've done a really nice job with them. There's definitely a few hiccups along the way, a few things that should have been tweaked and in some cases were tweaked, like the Ripley re-release, but all in all a very healthy collection to invest in. Next time I'll be taking a look at the aliens. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.